25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum, too.
And that would include Canada. No country sells as much steel and aluminum to the U.S. as ours. We'll take you live to Trump as soon as he starts speaking from the White House. We're also watching for the Canadian response. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has yet to address Trump's latest salvo. Opposition leaders are demanding tit-for-tat pushback.
We will retaliate in kind with matching tariffs on American aluminum and steel.
Now Canadians are pissed off. We've got to fight back. We got to punch back.
Just ahead, Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe joins us from Washington. We'll also speak to Canada's former ambassador to the U.S., David McNaughton, who has seen this movie before. And we'll find out from industry how this could affect jobs and the cost of living. Power and Politics starts right now. So, we're waiting to hear from U.S. President Donald Trump, who just minutes from now could announce this administration's first tariffs on Canada. Yesterday, Trump said he'd detail 25% tariffs on all steel and aluminum imports today, with no word of an exemption for this country. For both metals, Canada exports a lot. Canada sent 6 million tons of steel to the U.S. in 2024. That's the most of any country. But the U.S. is much more reliant on Canada for aluminum. Last year, Canada exported more than double the aluminum to the U.S. than the next 9 nations combined. So as Canada's premiers head to Washington this week, how will they make the case against these tariffs? Scott Moe is the premier of Saskatchewan. Hello.
Hello, Catherine.
Now, there is so much chaos right now in Washington surrounding Donald Trump's agenda. I wonder, as you speak to industry leaders today, to what extent is the anxiety over tariffs in Canada even on their radar?
I think it's pretty real. And I think it really speaks to the understanding that, whether it be the energy industry, the manufacturing industry, the agriculture industry, and various stages of each of those industries, how integrated we are across the 49th parallel, how integrated the Canadian-American economy is. And it's very well understood by, industry representatives, industry leaders, and those involved in, all of the aforementioned industries. So it's very, very real at the industry level. And it's incumbent on them, as well as us as Canadian politicians, to ensure that the policy and decision makers in Washington, D.C. and across the U.S. understand that just as well.
So are you trying to change any minds while you're in D.C., or is this about recruiting cheerleaders for Canada?
Well, this is about changing minds, and changing minds not just in the short term, but changing minds for the long term. We have a great North American economy. And we traditionally have, not just for the last number of decades, but for over a century, have created value together. Not in spite of one another, not in place of one another, but create value, and we create energy security, and we create food security and manufacturing security together. And that is what we are reminding our allies and the decision makers within the President Trump administration, as well as congressmen, Senate members, and governors across the nation. And that's what we've been up to the last couple of months, and that's what we're certainly up to this week.
But when you listen to the president, he doesn't say, oh, it's so wonderful we're doing this together. He's saying, we don't need you guys. We could do this ourselves. How do you change a mind in the face of that?
Well, that's why we need to make sure that the folks that might be in the room when those decisions are made understand to the full extent what the consequences of decisions like blanket tariffs across the board, what those consequences actually are. It means higher inflationary costs for not just Canadian families, but American families as well, at the gas pump, at the grocery store. And ultimately, any sustained environment where there's tariffs in place are going to mean job losses, and not just north of the 49th parallel, but are going to mean job losses throughout the U.S. as well. That's how integrated our economies are. And that's really some of the nervousness, I think, that you'll find in industry leaders, many of which we've met with not only today, but the last number of weeks.
If Donald Trump does enact steel and aluminum tariffs, essentially any minute now, how would you like to see Canada respond?
Well, we'll have to have a discussion with the federal government with respect to, is this a response that, does include, some type of tariff response? I would be very wary, and I am very wary of any counter response that involves tariffs for the sake of tariffs' sake. Tariffs are not helpful. whether President Trump is putting tariffs on aluminum and steel, or whether the Canadian government in some way is counter-tariffing. Tariffs are not helpful for what it costs you and I and Canadians and Americans to live each and every day, but they're also not helpful when it comes to how our economy works from an efficiency and effectiveness perspective, and they do mean that some people will lose their jobs. So we should be very, very wary about any conversation. First, I would say with tariffs, but second, to from Canada's perspective, any counter tariffs, because they have an equal impact on jobs and opportunities that we have as North Americans.
You seem to be, Premier, in the political minority on that front. When I think about what I'm hearing from the different political parties, I know both the Liberal leadership candidates have talked about a strong response. Pierre Poilievre, Jagmeet Singh. There are discussions about how hard to punch back, but you hear this argument, well, Donald Trump doesn't respect weakness. How do you stand up to a bully? How do you intend to change the minds of people in the Canadian federal government or across Canada to see your perspective on this?
Well, there has been some discussion about very targeted tariffs that would have an impact to change, if you will, the hearts and minds of policymakers in the U.S. And at the end of the day, that's what needs to happen is, there are certain policymakers that need to convince the president that these tariffs are harmful to Americans, not just Canadians, but are harmful to Americans as well. And so, the very targeted discussion around potential tariffs is one that is fine. But the larger opportunity that we have in this very tenuous and challenging and sensitive discussion is, and what we should be discussing as Canadian leaders is how do we get back to where we want to be, which is a non-tariff environment. So let's talk about the advantages of not having tariffs, whether they be President Trump's tariffs or counter tariffs on the general North American economy. Let's look at.
So are you all carrot, no stick then, Premier Moe? Is that what I should understand?
No. When we have the discussions about some targeted tariffs, those very much are a stick.
Okay.
But they're targeted. They're not broad blanket tariffs, which are harmful to everyone.
Okay. You're not just going to Washington, D.C., you're also headed to Mexico. We know things have been a bit awkward, perhaps a bit tense between Canada and Mexico. I'm thinking particularly when Ontario's Doug Ford talked about essentially cutting Mexico out of NAFTA. How touchy is the relationship right now, would you say?
Well, I think there's always sensitivities in any relationship. Mexico is a significant market for Saskatchewan. We do over $1 billion of exports to Mexico, and they are, a valued trading partner. That's why we have a provincial office, trade and export office that operates in Mexico. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time there as well, meeting with decision makers. As one, they're a large market for us. Two, they're the third partner in the USMCA agreement, which we're going to get to renegotiating here in the not too distant future. And I would point to really Mexico helping lead that agreement to fruition last time when we were down there with a number of premiers alongside Chrystia Freeland. And it was really Mexico that found our way to an agreement on USMCA, and then Canada really came in after the fact.
Okay. Interesting. I do want to turn back to this question of the relationship between Canada and specifically Donald Trump. The comments he's making, the 51st state, more and more we hear him talking about Canada not being a viable country, talking about the idea that, their military wouldn't necessarily defend us. Do you think Donald Trump is a threat to Canadian sovereignty right now, Premier?
No, there is the only threat that could ever be to Canadian sovereignty is ourselves. We should never be putting ourselves. And first, let me clarify: under no circumstances do I think Canada should be a 51st state or could be a 51st state. But we should make sure that we don't put ourselves in the vulnerable position where that kind of talk can even be considered. And by vulnerable position, I mean we need to make policy decisions. And you can ask yourself about the policy decisions we've made over the last number of years. We need to make policy decisions that prioritize our strength, prioritize our ability to be energy secure as a nation, food secure, and manufacturing secure. I don't know that all of the decisions that our current government has made have been focused on enhancing our economic security, enhancing our energy security, and enhancing the strengths that we have as a nation. And so Canada is a great independent nation, a nation that we continue to support for sure as Canadians in the province of Saskatchewan, but we also support the broader trade relationships that we have with a country like the United States. So any waffling that might happen there is due to a lack of leadership or a lack of focused policy development in our nation's capital with our government.
One of the ways that the federal government is trying to sort of firm up Canada's muscles, I guess, at this point, is this talk of interprovincial trade barriers. Anita Anand, the minister in charge of the file, has said they could be knocked down essentially within the month. Do you think that's realistic?
Well, it would be much more than has been achieved over the last number of decades. And listen, we're looking to remove as many of the exemptions, if not all of the exemptions, that Saskatchewan has as part of the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. The federal government has the most, and to their credit, they've been committed to reducing that to under half. I think they have 40. We have about 7. But the largest interprovincial trade barrier that we have in this nation is our inability to build a pipe and to have a highly functioning rail system and port system, so that each Canadian industry has reliable access day in, day out to our ports and to Canadian customers. And so, the fact that we've had policy decisions that have inhibited our ability to provide, in our case, our interest as Western Canadian energy to other Canadians is a failure a failure in leadership of the Liberal government. Now we see them changing their position, leadership candidates, and even the Minister of Energy changing their position on national infrastructure like pipeline infrastructure, Energy East infrastructure. But they've been the problem, and they've been the holdup for far too many years in the largest interprovincial trade barrier that Canada has, our ability to get energy back and forth.
So first of all, Premier, I'm not sure that answers my question about 30 days. I see your passion on the issue, but in terms of the timeline, realistic or no?
It is realistic to remove a large number of exemptions that are in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. Again, that's much on Minister Anand, as a large number of them are the federal governments. But there's other provinces that need to be equally committed. If we're going to go down to 1 or 2 or 3 from Saskatchewan's perspective, our expectation is that provinces that have 20 or 30 have a long ways to come.
Is there a particular province that you're pointing to there, sir? I know Quebec has added restrictions because of the emphasis on the French language.
Yes, there's a number of provinces, Quebec among them.
We've only got a moment left. You keep talking about pipelines, so I think I'd be remiss not to ask you. There is this renewed enthusiasm for a west to east pipeline, but there are no, as far as I'm aware of, commercial proponents. You mentioned Energy East. It's clear that project is dead, that particular project. It would have to start from scratch at this point. How likely, really, looking at the commercial environment right now, is it that we would see a west to east pipeline in Canada?
It's dead because the Liberal government killed it.
Well, there's also no industrial partner to take it on right now, right, at this moment, if we're talking about the future.
There was until the Liberal government killed it with the introduction of Bill C-69. And people should remember why we are vulnerable in this nation when it comes to being energy secure, why we have really an inability to participate in the energy dominance conversation that the U.S. Wants to participate in and wants to get to, is because of the policy decisions that we've made over the course of the last 9 years. And we need to remember that as we face quite likely a general election this year. We need to do better as Canadians in ensuring we are preserving our ability to be energy secure, food secure, and ensure that our trading partners value us as a nation and being part of that partnership.
Okay, we are right out of time. Premier Scott Moe, thank you for making the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much, Catherine.
Still to come tonight, the Power Panel reacts to the U.S. president's looming tariffs on steel and aluminum and debates how the federal government should respond. But first, what did Canada learn the first time Trump imposed similar tariffs? Let's ask Canada's former ambassador to the U.S., David McNaughton. Please stay with us. Got a live look at the White House for you there. This hour, U.S. President Donald Trump is expected to sign a new round of executive orders. Among those could be a directive to impose a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports, including those from Canada. My next guest led negotiations with the U.S. during Trump's first administration when Trump imposed similar tariffs. David McNaughton, former Canadian ambassador to the United States. Hello, sir.
Hi, how are you today?
I'm well. I want to sort of pull on your experience here. Obviously, we don't know for certain what is going to happen. It's probably dangerous to assume when Donald Trump's in the White House. But we know from last time, Canada spent about a year trying to get these similar tariffs reversed. What do you think is the best case scenario for Canada at this moment? Are we in for at least a year of this?
Well, I think we're in for certainly several months of profound uncertainty, whether it be on steel and aluminum tariffs or on some of the other tariffs that Trump has proposed. And I think the reason for that is, he's feeling, pretty confident of himself. He, doesn't have the same kind of checks and balances, I think, that he had the first go around. I know that when we were, he used the Section 232, which says that steel and aluminum tariffs from Canada or imports from Canada were a national security threat. And I worked really hard with the security and defense establishment in the United States to say, this is not good. I mean, you expect us to be your ally and a supporter. The aluminum industry in Canada was started in large part to provide material for their defense industry. And that kind of integration and security has been the case for a long, long time. And at one point, I said to one of the security people in the U.S., you keep those tariffs on for too much longer, we are going to become a national security threat.
Spicy.
Well, sometimes you got to be a little bit feisty with them, but Donald Trump right now doesn't have the same kind of checks and balances as he had the first time, and so I think we're in for a fairly long haul on this.
So a couple of things there. One, I'm sure a lot of people thought, as you said, national security threat. It's pretty striking that this is a man who is out there saying Canada isn't necessarily a viable country. It will be interesting to see if the case that he makes is once again that we could be a national security threat, or that these imports could be. Your point, though, about how things are a bit different this time. Do you think counter tariffs are the way to go this time, or we're just Trump 2.0 is a whole new ballgame?
Well, I think it's a bit of a new ballgame. I mean, you have Bob Lighthizer, who was the trade advisor in the U.S. trade representative in the first go round, was tough, but he was also, he liked to actually talk about facts. What you got right now is Peter Navarro, sitting beside Donald Trump, yapping in his ear. And Peter Navarro, the biggest thing I can say about him is that he doesn't really worry about facts. I mean, this $200 billion number and everything else is just ridiculous. But it's kind of, as I say, he's got the sycophants and the people who tell him what he wants to hear beside him. And it's going to take a while until, there's some impact on the U.S., either the inflation rate or, that industry is going to start speaking up. Because right now, I just don't think U.S. business is speaking up at all. I think they're afraid to. They don't want to become a target. So it's going to be a challenge for us. There's no question in my mind.
And if Canada does respond, I'll say in kind, we don't know what it's going to look like, but if we borrowed from the playbook from last time around, 2018, 2019, I'm trying to think about the fact that this is happening against the backdrop of this 30-day reprieve, where we could actually find ourselves also talking about counter tariffs on a much larger scale. If we use some of our ammo now, does that weaken us for something that could just happen in a few weeks' time?
Well, I think Premier Mo's response, which was to use targeted tariffs and targeted action, is the right response. I think across the board, tariffs on steel and aluminum that comes from the United States is not the right answer. I mean, I recall a lot of the Americans don't understand that Canada is a big market for a lot of things that are particularly politically sensitive, like agriculture. There's technology that we use up here in our healthcare system that if we stopped procuring it from the U.S., there are a lot of states would feel the bite. So I think across the board tariffs, in response, tit for tat response, I wouldn't be inclined to do that. I'd agree with Premier Moe that a more targeted approach, which gets their attention, but doesn't cause huge impacts on Canada and inflames the rhetoric even more. I think that's probably the way to go.
I'd like to get your take on something else Premier Moe said towards the end of our discussion, where he made the case that the threat to Canadian sovereignty is only actions that can be taken within this country. And he specifically argued that infrastructure, pipelines, and the lack thereof has weakened Canada. What would you say to that?
Well, I think he's right to a certain degree. I don't think, putting all of the blame on Ottawa or the current government is an appropriate response. And I think right now, sort of putting a bit of the partisanship behind us is where we should go. I mean, it was under the current government that the TMX pipeline got built to the West Coast. We do have an LNG project or two coming on. I think we need to do more, but I don't think it's all something that is worthwhile just simply saying, well, it was all the federal government's response. I mean, provinces like New Brunswick decided to ban fracking, even though they've got natural gas under the ground. And instead, what they're doing is they're importing natural gas from Pennsylvania. And guess how they got it out of the ground in Pennsylvania? Fracking. So we do need to look at getting our infrastructure built a lot quicker. When I was in Washington, I was trying to talk to the Americans about our critical minerals, and I talked to the then National Security Advisor and said, why aren't you doing the same thing with us that you did on aluminum in terms of taking take-or-pay contracts or loaning money to us? And he said, David, we'd love to, but we need it before 2050 when you guys get it out of the ground. So, in part, I agree with Premier Moe, but I don't think it's helpful to just put all the blame on one party or one level of government. I think we all bear some responsibility for this, and I think people are coming around to the reality that we could do a lot more, both in terms of energy, in terms of agriculture and food, and maybe Donald Trump's rhetoric and bluster will kind of wake us up. But hopefully, we pull together, not decide to point fingers.
Well, and to that end, I want to finish on this question of the "it's a real thing" comment from the Prime Minister on Friday, right? His sense that, as he said to a group of about 200 business people, labor leaders, Trump wants our critical minerals. It's a real thing. Donald Trump was asked about it. He's like, yeah, it is a real thing. What, if anything, can Canada do about that? Or do we just kind of have to take that rhetoric for the next 4 years?
Well, I think that it's going to be for a few years. I think probably, if the impact on U.S. consumers is what I think it's going to be, he'll have a tough time at the midterms. So there'll be some restraint on it. But, the Canadians are angry at the present moment at what this kind of talk has done. And I think, I always say to my American friends, we like to apologize. We like to say we're sorry. We're nice people, but we're also hockey players, and you should never forget that. And I think what's come to the fore in all of this is a renewed sense of Canadian nationalism. And and now we just need to use it in a positive way to, diversify our markets, make us more productive, do all the things that we should have been doing for some considerable period of time. I hope we still remain friends with the United States, and they are a big market, and we will never get, totally away from it. but I kind of like the feistiness of Canadians these days. I think it's kind of inspiring, actually.
Well, I'm a big fan of a little feistiness myself. Thank you very much for this conversation. Appreciate it.
All right, take care.
David McNaughton, former Canadian ambassador to the United States. Well, we have our eye on the Oval Office, and we'll bring you any news of those tariffs when we get it. Plus, the Power Panel is here. They'll debate how the Canadian government should respond to President Trump's latest tariff threat. Stay with us. That was moments ago in Paris. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau returning to his hotel and finding questions from reporters after he attended an AI summit today. But the Prime Minister has yet to comment on President Trump's latest tariff threat. We're going to take a live look now at the White House, where we are also waiting for news. Any moment now, Trump could sign an executive order putting tariffs on all steel and aluminum going into the United States. He's announced these tariffs would be coming while speaking to reporters yesterday.
We'll also be announcing steel tariffs on Monday.
On this tomorrow?
Monday, yeah, tomorrow.
What countries will those go on?
Everybody, steel.
Including Canada and Mexico?
Yeah, any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum too.
10%?
25%.
25 for aluminum as well?
25 for both.
The federal government has not responded to these incoming tariffs. A senior Canadian government official told CBC News it is waiting to see the order in writing, aren't we all? But the opposition leaders said today that Canada must respond dollar for dollar.
We will retaliate in kind with matching tariffs on American aluminum and steel, all of the proceeds of which will be given back to our steel and aluminum industry, and any surplus will be given in tax relief for our people.
We should respond with retaliatory tariffs, dollar for dollar. And then on top of that, I want supports in place for the workers impacted. In this case, starting with steel and aluminum, but we need a package in place for all the workers and all the sectors that might be impacted.
In moments of uncertainty, who can we turn to? Well, it's the Power Panel. Rob Russo is the Canada correspondent for The Economist. Ginny Roth is a former Conservative campaign strategist. And here with me in studio, Vandana Qatar is a former advisor to Prime Minister Trudeau. And Jordan Leichnitz is a former NDP strategist. Hello, everybody. Rob, I want to start with you. So here we are once again sort of teetering on this moment. You know, it was only a week ago that we got the reprieve from the tariffs, now across the board tariffs, and now we're sort of wobbling, wondering if we're about to fall into another tariff pit. How are you making sense of this moment?
By not trying to make sense. I actually think that silence in this instance by the government is wit. Silence is wisdom. What have we got? We've got a president who said he's going to bring in 25% tariffs. You wait to make sure that this is not part of the roller coaster whimsical ride that the president likes to take us on, gut churning as it might be. You pay no heed to what he says, but you do go over legal documents if there are documents that are accompanying this. And so far, there aren't. What do the documents say? What is the basis for any kind of tariffs? What part of U.S. law is he using in order to bring in these tariffs now? When do they take effect? None of these questions are answered now. We don't know that they're coming in. So what else do we do? Well, we count on the U.S. consumer. I think with the adventure that we had in the first weekend of February when he was talking about bringing in across-the-board tariffs on Canada, 25% and 10% for energy, the U.S. consumer came to our rescue in a way by calling on their members of Congress, senators and congressmen, and telling them, we don't want to pay more for gasoline. We don't want to pay more for other goods coming from Canada, for lumber and other things. Count on the U.S. consumer, get your ducks in a row, and remember to tell them that their cars, their airplanes, their missiles will cost more money. But for now, silence is wit and wisdom.
Vandana, we heard the argument earlier in the show from Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe talking about the fact that a response, counter tariffs hurt Canadians. So talk to me a little bit about the calculation around calibrating a response. To Rob's point, we don't know what's coming, but as we think of the bigger picture and how to respond, what comes to your mind?
We're going to navigate a few things. I think one, and something that Flavio Boppi said on social yesterday, is stop reacting to everything he says. That's what he wants. It's a way he tries to negotiate, try to get what he wants from this, and cause fear amongst Canadian concerns and force politicians their hand, right, or to show their hand. So I think that's one aspect of it. So keep calm, carry on, and be prepared. Be prepared that this is most likely going to happen, or it may not happen, or he'll turn to something else, or on Wednesday something else will happen.
Well, and on that note, as the executive orders come in, plastic straws are back. No word on tariffs yet, but something else has come in.
Well, there we go. I'm sure some people will be very happy with that. But, this is going to be the next 4 years. He's going to say one thing, say something else. He's going to change the goalposts over and over again. So that's one piece. I think for Scott Moe, and he didn't quite outright say it, I think for a lot of these economies, these tariffs will definitely hurt. I think of steel and aluminum in Quebec. Like there's oil, energy in like across the prairies. Like so they're going to protect their own economies too. But I respect that he also was trying to keep a national front, a national unity front. Like I got to work with the federal government. I heard him say that to you. So I think that's good. I think that needs to continue. But just be mindful that some people might say, isn't it easier? And because they have to respond to their electorate too. Like, how am I protecting you?
Ginny, I wonder about Pierre Poilievre in all of this when there isn't a lot of daylight between the federal leaders. Obviously, he's out there. He's today putting out a position in terms of what could be done in Canada's north to firm up Canada's position in the Arctic. But on the fundamental question of the day, which is about tariffs, if all the major party leaders seem to be more or less in agreement, where does that leave Pierre Poilievre in terms of the argument that he is trying to make to just get himself in the conversation?
Well, let me talk about a few big differences, maybe. One is, I think, especially on steel, Trump's issue is clearly with China. And frankly, Canada should be too. That is where we know the steel dumping is coming from. That's what's distorting markets. That's the market that no one can trade freely with because they're not fair. And so I think that's why you saw Poilievre come out with tariffs against China before our government did, because he was trying to show to the U.S. that he was serious about not being a backdoor to China.
I'm going to jump in here, Ginny, just because we have the news that we have been spending much of the day waiting for. The alerts coming out on the wires right now. Trump signs 2 proclamations that extend original 2018 Section 232 investigation. Says White House official, aluminum tariffs are being raised to 25% from 10%. White House official proclamations will reinstate 25% tariff on steel imports for all countries. And of course, that is the important part for Canada, not necessarily coming as an enormous surprise to anybody who's been paying attention to the news today. But given all the back and forth, important to know that it looks like the action we've been waiting to see is actually happening now. I apologize, Ginny. I did interrupt you. If you want to talk a little, if you want to weigh in a little bit more on Mr. Poilievre's next steps here, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, look, the tariffs are on all countries. But I think ultimately the end game here is to really ice out China. And Poilievre has shown that he's more serious about that, I would argue, than the current government. The second thing is how we treat steel production domestically. We currently have a huge carbon tax. And, you know, the leading contender for the Liberal leadership, Mark Carney, has said he wants to have a carbon tax in the form of an industrial price. So
does that suggest Mr. Poilievre doesn't want industrial carbon pricing, Ginny?
Well, he doesn't want Carney's plan.
Sure, but whether he wants industrial carbon pricing is, I think unto itself a very significant.
Poilievre has said is up to the provinces, and that he doesn't think there should be a carbon tax. So I take that to mean that he doesn't want to add costs, both in the form of carbon price and also in the form of insane regulation, right? Like ask steel producers in Canada about the extent to which they've been taxed and regulated by their own country. And so there are things we can do. Like these companies don't produce steel in a vacuum. You have to push back on tariffs, which, as you said, Poilievre, there's not a lot of daylight between the leaders on retaliation, and I think that's good. I think the U.S. needs to understand that we will retaliate, and that, to Rob's point, consumers in the U.S. will feel the impact of this because they buy so much of our steel today. But we also have to think about what we do for Canada and within Canada and the policies that have led us to this point where our steel producers are so much more vulnerable to these tariffs because of domestic policy to date.
Okay, so a couple of things to say here. Donald Trump making comments in the White House. Obviously, as soon as we have tape of these comments, we will put it to air. We're just waiting for that tape to be returned. Ginny raised the point of questions about steel dumping and the alerts coming over the wire suggesting that Peter Navarro is talking about how Trump's actions will end foreign dumping, boost domestic production, secure steel and aluminum industries as a backbone of U.S. security. Now, it is worth noting that Canada does have measures in place to counter the presence of Chinese steel in this country, measures that have come into place since the last time we had this particular discussion with the United States. And folks in industry have talked about the idea that Canada has shored up its efforts on that front, that ought to have perhaps protected us, Jordan, from the situation we now find ourselves in. Obviously, that wasn't the case. And I guess it brings us back to this fundamental question of when these are core values for Donald Trump and his administration. You know, as Canadians potentially sit through counter tariffs and feel the squeeze and the pain of some of these things, how do politicians ask them to make sense of the fact that their lives are getting harder and we don't know if we're throwing spaghetti at the wall or not here?
Yeah, it's a really tough one because I think the operating mission of Trump as president is chaos, right? And it's the instability and his desire to keep those he views as his opponents, which includes, unfortunately, Canada as his closest ally, off balance. And so I think one of the things, and Rob talked about this as well, is that jumping at every word he says does feed into that cycle of chaos. So I think you did see a fairly restrained response kind of across the political spectrum in Canada today. Not a whole lot of daylight between people on retaliation, because there is a sense that the only way to make a meaningful pushback to this type of action is with strength, with a show of force. Now, unfortunately, of course, that does mean that that is going to put some burden on Canadian industry. And I think that that's where some of the things that you saw Jagmeet Singh and the NDP talking about today are going to be really important. And the labour movement was out talking about this as well, the need for greater supports for workers to shore up things like our employment insurance system, which we know does have major gaps in it ahead of time, ahead of knowing that there's going to potentially be layoffs, not just in these two sectors, but perhaps more broadly as we see bigger tariffs coming in maybe later in the month. So there's things that can be done right now. There's things that can be done in the medium and the long term around diversifying our trade relationships. Arguably, this is a conversation that we had in the first Trump term that we did not maybe follow all the way through under the Liberal government. And so that's something that needs further attention for sure. And so those are steps that can be taken here in Canada. But I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to face is that the sort of pain here at home for any counter tariffs that happen is not going to be felt equally across regions and industries. And so that's going to be really, I think, one of the biggest challenges for this federal government or any future federal government to manage is some of those regional inequities.
Rob, that raises such an interesting point. I will also just note we're getting these alerts coming out across the wires, primarily from our colleagues at Reuters, waiting still to get the tape in, which again we will play the moment that we have it. Donald Trump saying no exceptions or exemptions. Certainly there were some in Canada that hoped that there, and still I'm sure hope that there is a path forward for Canada where Canada could secure an exception or exemption. Although, as we've been discussing all through the program, Canada is the biggest source of imports for both aluminum and steel. So exemptions on that front would be quite significant. Rob, I think what Jordan was talking about there is so interesting because, of course, we just heard David McNaughton talking a few minutes ago about this sense of feistiness, this sense of unity that we feel in the country right now and trying to put that to good purpose. And yet you can imagine that kind of smashing up against the sense of regional difference that Jordan is talking about that might sort of get pulled at as some folks feel the pressure of this tariff pain, I suppose. Talk to me a bit about what comes to your mind when you think about the path forward for Canada and all trying to stay on the same page and maximize our sense of unity and nationhood right now.
Sure. I mean, I think there are a couple of things we need to clarify first. I don't know if the alerts make this clear, but are the tariffs effective immediately, or is there an active date when they do come into effect? There's an active date.
No data available to us yet. Yeah.
Okay, because if there's a later date, that leaves time for the kind of horse trading that we saw that led to an extension for Canada. That's an important thing to do. Look, the reality is the United States does not have the capacity to supply its own steel, let alone its own aluminum. In aluminum alone, it would take the construction of 6 more Hoover dams for the United States to supply its own aluminum. That would take decades. Okay, it's not going to happen. So again, Canadian consumer comes to our American consumer comes to our aid. The other thing that we need to do is the last set of tariffs was punitive against Canada and Mexico. They were aimed to be punitive. This is broad across the world. So we need to coordinate with our allies to make sure that we don't get into a dumping war with them. That would be important to make sure that a bad situation doesn't get worse. I think the next thing that Canada needs to do, or is thinking about doing, is start thinking about big infrastructure projects that need to be developed here in Canada and get them up on the board quickly in order to deal with what could be a surplus in steel and aluminum. The other thing that I think everybody is probably aware of is the Canadian government has in place, and they had in place ahead of the last tariff threat, a fairly robust package of supports for workers and businesses affected by this. Everything from supplying credit for businesses that might face a credit crunch if this happens, to waiving the waiting period for EI. If all of a sudden you're an aluminum worker in Arvida, Quebec, and you're thrown out of work, you won't have to wait the usual period. So there are things already that are sort of in the catapult waiting to be shot out that way. But there's going to be some quick thinking that needs to be done to prevent dumping, and also to get infrastructure projects, to get that surplus used for worthy projects here in Canada.
That's interesting. BC has, in fact, identified projects to fast track, although to my mind, they were not specifically about steel and aluminum, but just this broader conversation about Canada standing on its own 2 feet. It feels almost cartoonish to keep reading these red alerts off the wires as we talk about remaining calm. But additional comments from Donald Trump that they're also looking at tariffs on cars, chips, and pharmaceuticals. Obviously, all of those things would be of concern to Canadians. And we heard Donald Trump talking about reciprocal tariffs last night. We're still trying to get a sense of the shape of that and what that would mean. He says those we will do reciprocal tariffs in the next 2 days. So obviously, what does do mean? We will try to figure that out.
Could I just jump in, Catherine, with one more figures, because I work for a magazine that fills my head with figures. And I think an important figure for Canadians to realize is $36 trillion in debt. That's what the United States has for debt. We have a debt to GDP ratio of around 42%. They have a debt to GDP ratio of 120%. If they want to cut taxes and do it in a way that doesn't have the IMF knocking on their door, they're going to have to raise money. So I think the world is going to have to realize that tariffs are going to be part of our future, and American consumers might have to realize that as well.
Well, and interestingly, perhaps in that vein, Trump asked what if other countries retaliate, says he does not mind, which is, I think, an interesting contrast to the situation we found ourselves in just recently with these across-the-board tariffs, when it was suggested that if Canada were to retaliate, that there would be further retaliation. Ginny, I want to go big picture with you for a sec, because as we talk about, remaining calm, not freaking out, understanding that Trump is perhaps trying to uses destabilizing people and this sort of scattershot chaos of information as a means of keeping the people he's dealing with destabilized. Do you think that means for Canadians on this question of our sovereignty that we are just going to have to eat these comments that we are, not a viable country, that the United States wants to absorb us in some function for the next 4 years? Should Canadians sort of wrap their brain around the fact that we just have to suck it up?
Well, I don't think we should dismiss it as a joke, as the government initially did. I think we should take it seriously, but I also don't think we should light our hair on fire. We have to be reasonable about what we can do. We have to push back on punitive tariffs, and we have to do things that, frankly, many of us thought we should have already been doing. Strengthening our border, strengthening our ports, strengthening defense spending, strengthening our presence in the Arctic, all the things that a serious country would and should do. I think we should do that anyway, regardless of what Trump thinks. Trump happens to have raised it recently. And so my hope is that it causes Canadians to take that a little more seriously and want that in a future government. And I think you're hearing a bit of that from Poilievre. And even, on this question of our GDP and the GDP hit we could sustain, it caused us to have a slightly more serious conversation about interprovincial trade. Suddenly you have cabinet ministers who are opposed to pipelines and transferring oil and gas across the province say maybe we do need an east-west pipeline. These are the kinds of things that a serious country would do and pursue, and maybe this is an opportunity to finally do that.
A question I really wonder about, though, Ginny, when we talk about being serious about the border, this $1.3 billion border plan, the things like the leasing the Black Hawk helicopters, where is the line between what's serious and what is a show for Donald Trump? I'm obviously not personally an expert in border security, and I don't deny that helicopters could serve a purpose, but I think I also have some question of where the line is between what's in Canadians' best interest and what is about making a point to the Americans.
I think that's a reasonable question. I mean, you have an incumbent government that, and a Liberal Party that does seem to be doing these things for show. I think because they're sort of flailing from one end to the other, trying to respond to what Trump wants of people. When you had immigration surge totally out of control to really, really high levels, you had Roxham Road as a problem for serious parts of the last 9 years. Liberals been in power, just not taking the border seriously. And then you have Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives who have been talking for years about how we have to be more serious about cars, auto theft, and how cars get shipped out at our ports, immigration levels, and what's the right mix for what our economy needs and what we can absorb. Like, all those things are not responses to Trump. They're just serious policies about what we need to do to be a sovereign country and have secure borders when it comes to both the movement of people and goods, criminal behavior, all that kind of thing that a reasonable government would do. And then, frankly, the Stephen Harper government was quite serious about. And so I agree, we shouldn't be, the helicopters, like, I'm not an expert, I don't know the specific role that they're playing, but we shouldn't be aiming for the TV clips or like the Fox News hit. We should be doing what's right for the country.
Yeah, I mean, I know someone is going to point out that Stephen Harper did make some cuts to border security, but the broader point, the CBSA agent specifically, Vandana, though, Ginny has raised some questions about the seriousness with which Canada has dealt with a whole multitude of issues. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we have been dealing with those. The government has dealt with those issues. There has been money at the border before all this has happened.
And yet this significant increase seems to be necessary, right? So there's a bit of a challenge there of saying, well, we were doing the thing, but also we're going to do $1.3 billion more of the thing.
Sure, we are doing the things, and then someone else comes and says, but I want more of the things. So you're going to add more to the things, right, in order to help save Canadians. Canadians are also, you're also able to lift and shift as the environment changes. So, Roxham Road, there was a renegotiation of the safe third-party agreement. Like, those things do get fixed. Do they get the airtime on the day-to-day basis the way they are now? Absolutely not, right? So unless you're tuned into those issues, may not have noticed them. But I will say on this point, yes, like, if Trump is saying there's a border issue, you're going to put more money into it. Even if you put money before it saying, oh, I did this already, isn't it going to be enough for him? So you're going to showcase, okay, what else do you need? We're going to put more money into the border. We're going to help alleviate any concerns you have. But this is the border. There'll be something else tomorrow.
Okay. Jordan, what do you think about this question of how Canada, the positioning Canada now finds itself in as it tries to show both its sovereignty, its seriousness as a country, and just push back against Trump generally?
Well, I'm an old timer, so my mind reaches back to the Harper government. And, look, clearly we have problems with our military capacity. We have issues with our border security. But those issues also didn't arise yesterday. And I think, it's important to acknowledge that underfunding of the military is a problem that existed during the Harper government. In fact, the lowest spending in terms of GDP per capita was under the Harper government in modern history. So I don't think you can really tie that to one specific government in recent history. There's an ongoing problem there. Canada is going to need to look to its own security in a new way now. That much is clear. We have the capacity to make investments that benefit our communities as well as helping to meet that 2% target. Premier Canoe in Manitoba has been out talking a great deal about the way that some of those investments in Canadian defence can also shore up communities. And I think that there's a lot to be taken from that. But I did note with some interest today that Pierre Poilievre, as much as he was up in Nunavut making his announcement, appeared to do it without having had any conversation with the Premier of Iqaluit, who actually issued a letter saying, I'm sorry, but when you come to the north, you speak with Northerners. You don't tell us what to do with Southern priorities. So I think that there's certainly maybe something to be learned there for him and his team about how to approach some of these issues. It's not just symbolic. It is about working with the different regions of the country and bringing people together around some of these threats in a serious way.
Rob, I do think, there's this instinct to keep coming back to, we talked about it earlier, right? Canadians coming together and some of these solutions that get talked about as means of Canada muscling up for this moment, be it creating an east-west pipeline, diversifying trade with other countries, interprovincial trade. And I've said this on air a few times. Somebody's going to write me a letter at some point, but I have trouble even saying interprovincial trade barriers without rolling my eyes, because you, I'm sure, were the one who assigned me as soon as I got here to covering some of those issues, which was cough, cough, a decade ago. How realistic are these solutions that we're talking about, or these measures, I suppose? Solutions is perhaps not the right term, but these measures that we're talking about to try to sort of solidify Canada's footing right now?
Well, there are interim measures and there are longer term measures. Interim measures, there's still some capacity in the TMX pipeline. Canada, I believe, is already making the case to the United States that if you don't want more of our energy, and that would be a way, for instance, to very quickly deal with what Mr. Trump calls the trade deficit. If we sent less energy to the United States, we have more capacity to send it to TMX and send it to Asia. That would deal with the trade deficit very, very quickly. It would also result in an increase in the cost of gasoline to Midwestern drivers. The longer term thing, I think it makes more sense to build pipelines from the oil fields to the West Coast. That's really where the growth in oil and energy is going to be. I heard Jordan speak about being an old timer. Then that's an opening for me to allow for our Grandpa Simpson moment, because whenever I hear talk of the border, I'm reminded of the thundering baritone of Derek Burney, who greeted me when I was not wet behind the ears, but soaking behind the ears as a reporter during the '88 Free Trade Agreement. And his thundering voice is yelling right now, what about our interests on the border? Who is asking for something on our side of the border? Because the truth is, the United States is a net exporter of crime, of guns, of drugs to Canada. So what are we asking for them to do on their side of the border as well? Is anybody asking them for reciprocal hardening in terms of security of their side of the border? I don't hear a lot about that.
I was really hoping it was the, when I was your age, I used to wear an onion on my belt, Grandpa Simpson's quote. That was much more thoughtful, frankly, Rob Russo. Ginny, I'm curious. I was struck seeing Jagmeet Singh on CNN today making the case for Canada. We've seen a lot of Canadian cabinet ministers. We've seen premiers. Where are the federal Conservatives in terms of being out there making the case for Canada to Americans?
I mean, Pierre Poilievre was in the Arctic today making the case for Canada. And
But to Americans, I'm talking about. Yeah.
I mean, every time Pierre Poilievre opens his mouth, he says Canada first, and I think that's a message for Canadians. He's running to be Prime Minister of Canada. And, I think to Rob's point, the impact of tariffs on American consumers will make itself very, very clear very, very quickly. And I think, though, that impact will speak way louder than, frankly, a lot of, Johnny-come-lately, false, newfound patriotism on the part of a lot of left of center leaders, whether it's Liberal or NDP, who were recently calling Canada a genocidal state, post-national, the hotel of the world. All of a sudden now we're these grand patriots. And to go on CNN or whatever it is and spout off about how we have to fight back with no real substance behind it, all I think to kind of curry favor with, frankly, a left-wing audience in Canada back home, I just think is kind of grandstanding and doesn't really drive at serious solutions and a real plan. So I'm glad to see Poilievre speaking to Canadians and speaking about a specific plan about what he would do.
Vonda and I could see that you had some feelings about that. Would you like to respond?
I think two things can be true. I think Canada could have done genocidal cultural impacts on Indigenous communities and still be a place that you're proud of. My parents came to Canada in the 70s. They never taught me to be not proud of it, but like many countries, there's a history, and you can learn from that history, and there's beauty to the history, and there's bad things to the history. The point is, do you learn about it? I don't think that was the only thing we talked about in Canada. We've always said Canada is diversity is our strength. We've always talked about the people in Canada and how everyone, Canadians love us. People around the world love Canada. And I disagree with the fact that just because you can bring up wrongs that have happened doesn't mean you can't be proud of your country. In fact, it makes you more proud of your country because you can learn from that and do better. So I think that's short-sighted. I think the issue is that Mr. Poilievre, that is one thing to talk to Canadians, sure, but to actually get the job done and make the impact and make the conversation to Americans, to Rob's point, the American consumer can come to our rescue. Governors and other Congress people can come to our rescue and help make the case for why this is a bad idea. I think that is something he's falling short on.
Okay, I will just say for folks who are just tuning in, we are still waiting for tape from the White House. Donald Trump has indeed announced plans for tariffs. He signed the executive order going ahead with tariffs for steel and aluminum for countries across the world. But of course, Canada, being the biggest exporter of both steel and aluminum to the United States, is going to have a particular impact on this country. We are still waiting for that tape. We are going to bring it to you as soon as it is available. Right now, though, you get the best analysis and insight from your friends at the Power Panel. Jordan, I'm going to turn to you here. And maybe just reflect a bit on the path forward. There's been so much Canada kind of coming to the edge of the cliff, worrying about things, and we haven't actually felt the impact. Again, I don't have the piece of paper to put in front of you, but it seems that as if Donald Trump has gone ahead with this. So talk to me a bit about what you see as the path forward for Canada now.
Well, I mean, I think, of course, the most immediate thing is support for the affected industries, for the workers who may be impacted by layoffs very shortly. That's going to be the very first thing that I'm sure is on the minds of not just the federal government, but particularly the governments of Ontario and Quebec. I mean, the timing is also interesting because, of course, we're in the midst of an Ontario election. Steel tariffs have the biggest impact in Ontario, and Doug Ford is headed down as premier, but also simultaneously as candidate to Washington tomorrow to have some of these discussions. So it'll be interesting to see what impact there is. I'm sure he's actually in some way probably not unhappy to have something fresh to kind of talk about there to underline the urgency of that trip in the middle of a campaign. But I think more broadly, there needs to be ongoing work on the part of the federal government to bring the premiers together to continue those discussions. The risk of that regional fragmentation is going to increase as the pressure increases and as time goes on. Holding provinces like Alberta, like Saskatchewan, like Quebec on side is going to be a continuous, I think, challenge, and there's going to need to be those discussions. It has been interesting to see, for example, some new openness on the part of folks in Quebec to the idea of an east-west pipeline, something that would have been a complete political non-starter just a few years ago. And, and I think to Ginny's point, that was a challenge that even the Harper government had, even in arguably more favorable regulatory circumstances for the industry, they were still not able to get through those major projects. So things are changing on the ground very quickly, but what's going to be hard is to sustain that over the long term. And if we accept that tariffs are a part of the economic reality in our trade relationship with the United States, not just for the short term, but maybe more for the medium term, because they need it as a revenue generator, the challenge will be to hold people together across the country over that longer time period as things get a little bit harder and more expensive here at home too.
And Rob, one of the things that makes what is happening right now interesting is the fact that it does not just affect Canada or Canada and Mexico, although, again, as I keep saying, Canada is particularly hard hit. Can you reflect a little bit on the willingness of the world to sort of come together and push back against some of the things that Donald Trump is doing right now, be they just about sort of the economic might as he perceives it of the American nation, or his expansionist attitudes towards Greenland, the Panama Canal, and perhaps Canada too?
Well, we'll see. We didn't get a lot of very stout support anywhere when we were threatened with tariffs in the last round. It'll be interesting to see if there is some sort of coordination. There are other markets for our steel and our aluminum. We will be able to displace Chinese and Russian steel and aluminum if we do get some sort of coordination with our allies. But look, the reality is, even with reduction of internal trade barriers, even with greater trade agreements with our allies, there is a sort of magnetic pull to the south. It's because of geography, and it's also because with Mexico, there is a market of 500 million people over land without the need to ship, without the need to fly. That magnetic pull is irrevocable. So I think while we continue to work on other options and build up our own infrastructure and build up our own internal market, not a bad thing, right? That market to the south of us is worth billions and billions of dollars. Right now, it's just to the U.S. alone, it's $1.3 billion a day. Okay, so we're not going to be able to replace that by going overseas. I think the strategic objective of Canada remains to try and maintain low-cost access to the most lucrative market in the world, and that's south of our border. While we do those other things, yes, go ahead and do it, but we cannot negate the reality of that magnetic pull.
Okay. My thanks very much to the Power Panel for this conversation today as we get the breaking news that Donald Trump is indeed going ahead with these tariffs, 25% on steel and aluminum. He has signed the executive orders. There will be no exemptions that will include Canadian products as well. Thank you to the Power Panel, Rob Russo, Ginny Roth, Vandana Qatar, and Jordan Leibniz. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump, as we have been reporting, has signed the proclamation imposing that 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, saying there will be no exceptions or exemptions. We're still waiting on the tape, and of course, we're going to bring that to you as soon as it becomes available. Canada and Mexico will be among the hardest hit by these tariffs. Together, the two accounted for almost 40% of U.S. steel imports in 2024. This new tariff comes 1 week after President Trump pressed pause on tariffs after Mexico and Canada presented plans to secure their borders. But with this new targeted threat, what is in store for America's two largest trading partners? My next guest has firsthand experience negotiating on behalf of Mexico against Trump. Kenneth Smith-Ramos is Mexico's former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA and now a partner at Agon. Hello, thank you very much for making the time. I'm wondering, what would you say, sir, is the mood right now in Mexico with first the reprieve and then going ahead with these more specific tariffs?
Thank you very much, Catherine. Well, now that the tariffs have been imposed, there's definitely a somber mood. There was the expectation, given the reprieve that was obtained from the imposition of the 25% tariffs across the board, which Trump delayed for at least a month. There was the expectation, both from the Mexican government and the Mexican private sector, that there could be the possibility of having a constructive dialogue on the foreign policy issues that are of interest to the U.S. and also to Mexico, such as immigration and security, and to avoid the tariff threat. Now it seems that the U.S. certainly going back on its word, imposing tariffs as they did in 2018 on steel and aluminum products. It will have an impact in Mexico and Canada. As you well mentioned, Mexico is one of the top exporters, along with Canada, to the United States. And I just fail to see how the United States increases its competitiveness or strengthens its steel and aluminum sectors by hitting with tariffs its number one and number two trading partners, with whom there is a very symbiotic relationship when it comes to trade, not just in steel and aluminum, but in all manufacturing products and inputs for the manufacturing industry.
So, well, perhaps
will increase prices in the U.S. So, I mean, there's no benefit to them, really.
Well, I suppose one analysis of the situation, though, is that the benefit is perhaps that these tariffs line the U.S. coffers at a time where the United States is looking for revenue for some of its projects. And I guess, where does that leave both Mexico and Canada if both sort of ideologically, Donald Trump and his administration believe very much in these tariffs, but they have a sort of a financial motivation of sorts, an economic motivation in terms of fueling their own plans?
Yeah, of course. But at some point, public policy has to align with economic reality. I mean, it's one thing what Peter Navarro and his friends think in the White House. The reality is that, with the imposition of tariffs, not only are you violating the USMCA and subjecting yourself to retaliation from both Canada and Mexico, but it is a complete, misunderstanding of how tariffs work when they think they're really going to create a lot of wealth in the United States through tariffs. If tariffs are too high, as they are being put too high, in this case, what winds up happening is that trade with your trading partners starts slowing down, trickling down, or even disappearing. So either the importers, do not pay that extra cost in terms of the tariffs imposed because they stop importing from Mexico or from Canada, or at the end of the day, that supposed savings from the United States, gets passed on as a cost to U.S. consumers. Anybody who's involved in purchasing steel from abroad for construction, for the automotive sector, for machinery and equipment and aerospace is going to make products that are more costly, and at the end of the day, it's going to hit consumers in their pocketbook. So that's the reality of how tariffs work and the disruption that is created.
You, I'm sure, learned many lessons negotiating with Trump 1.0. Are many of those lessons, are there lessons that are applicable, or are we just dealing with a totally different animal in terms of the Trump 2.0 administration?
No, I think that, of course, Trump 2.0 seems to be much more aggressive on all fronts when it comes to foreign policy, much more interventionist when it comes to trade policy. This notion and mantra of tariffs as the way forward for U.S. trade policy. But in a way, President Trump is predictable. He's been consistent on these thoughts for a very long time, not just on tariffs, but on his obsession with the trade deficit, with offshoring when U.S. companies invest abroad. So at the same time, we can expect that even though he creates this tension, this disruption, which is part of his strategy to sort of soften up trading partners, he does leave room for negotiation. And I think that's what we saw in the USMCA. You may recall in 2017, 2018, numerous times he said he was going to pull out of the NAFTA. And at the end of the day, we wind up with a comprehensive, balanced agreement that's good for all three countries. So there is room for negotiation, but there is going to be a lot of turbulence. And I think it really hurts the U.S. credibility as a reliable trading partner, not just in North America, but to other countries in the world, when the U.S. demands that Europe opens markets or else, and they see how the U.S. is treating its number one, number two trading partners. Well, it's hard for the U.S. to demand for other countries to comply with international commitments when they are not willing to abide by theirs.
Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has said that Mexico is going to approach this with a cool head. I wonder what you would say about how her approach thus far seems to be working with Donald Trump.
Well, I think so far, I mean, at least until today, it has worked, because I think President Sheinbaum has been clear in stating that on the one hand, you need to be firm on saying if there's violations to the USMCA, Mexico has to take measures. But on the other hand, leaving a door open for a constructive dialogue in the case in particular that was discussed last week, which is immigration and security, and of course, the upcoming review of 2026. But amongst the lessons we learned from Trump 1.0 is that back in 2018, when the U.S. imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum against Mexico and Canada, within a month, Mexico and Canada had retaliated. In the case of Mexico, over $1 billion worth of retaliation. And that led the United States to sit down with Mexico and Canada and negotiate exemptions to the automotive sector for any measure on national security under Section 232, and then a special mechanism to negotiate any possible impact on other national security measures. So the lesson is clear. If you stand your ground, if you do honor the commitments in the USMCA and you defend them, maybe retaliation is also a good option. We don't want an escalation of trade war between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S., but you just can't let the United States completely roll over you. I think that's the strategy that so far Mexico has been pursuing. We will see what they do in terms of the tariffs that are being imposed today.
I'm curious what you would say about how the relationship between our two countries is doing, given that early on in this discussion, there were certainly politicians in Canada who frankly said, like, cut them loose. If it's in our best interest, bye-bye Mexico. How are things now?
Well, I mean, I said it at that time that it was a mistake in terms of trying to divide, Mexico and Canada, to try to separate each other and not work together as we did in many instances in the USMCA negotiation. I think, by working together, we were stronger in that negotiation, and we avoided many of the more protectionist or anti-free trade policies the U.S. was pursuing. So I think the best option for Mexico and Canada is precisely to try to have a constructive dialogue and try to figure out how to approach this situation with Trump. Not only in the actual discussions of the USMCA that will come later on this year, but immediately how to coordinate action on possible retaliation, what type of dialogue should take place between the presidents and the prime minister, and also at the levels of USTR and the Department of Commerce. At the end of the day, we benefit tremendously from a relationship where, we have over $50 billion in trade with Canada. Canada is our third largest investor in many important sectors such as manufacturing, energy, mining. So that relationship can only grow if we play it right and if we stick to what should be the future of the USMCA, which is having a trilateral agreement.
What about the 30-day reprieve or the 1-month reprieve? How much optimism are you feeling about that at this moment?
Well, I mean, not much really, because Trump can change his mind in a minute. I think it was a good result for President Sheinbaum through that call to be able to obtain that month reprieve. But it becomes very hard for countries to negotiate in good faith and with a constructive dialogue if you have a gun pointing at your head constantly. So I think at some point, the outcome of these discussions, and I hope that's taking place now between the Mexican government and the U.S. government, is to have a sort of agreement on disarming this tariff threat, right? So have a long-lasting peace, or at least in the medium term, while the countries work on foreign policy issues such as immigration and security, and certainly as the time approaches for the review in 2026. We are allies, we are partners, we've been friends for a very long time, the same as Mexico and Canada. We should not be pointing guns at each other, much less having trade wars between one another, because the only people that benefit from a trade war in North America is precisely our biggest competitors, is China and other countries that are probably laughing seeing what is going on between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S.
Yes, and that is a case that I know Canadians have been making even on cable news in the United States, and yet the question of the extent to which there is uptake on that. I'm curious also, one of the things I think Canadians are sort of struggling to come to terms with here is the kind of language that Donald Trump is using when he talks about Canada. Questioning whether it's even a viable country, concerned that he wants to annex or absorb this country through economic force. You know, I think it's safe to say, and I may not be speaking about politicians here, but there are some people in Canada who are pretty freaked out by that. No question, he has been being very provocative about Mexico too, right? He had that big prop yesterday, the Gulf of America map, sort of a little bit of swagger there. Tell me a little bit about how the national conversation is going in Mexico around those kinds of comments.
Well, definitely, just as with Trump 1.0, in Trump 2.0, what we're seeing is the population reacting to all of these messages, right? I mean, back in 2017, 2018, just as he's doing with Canada now, he put us through the ringer talking about, you know, the people that came from Mexico to the U.S. were all criminals. Yep. Mexico's going to pay for the border wall. So this is the MO that Trump utilizes to try to pressure trading partners, even allies. And it's very unfortunate. I mean, it's even gotten worse to the point where there's threats of, you know, taking Greenland, invading the Panama Canal, or buying out the Gaza. So, you know, you have to understand that within his logic, these are just negotiating positions. But the problem is the rest of the world doesn't know how far he's going to go, because in the case of tariffs, he has used them before. He's threatened to go all the way to 25%. And we know that within USTR and the Department of Commerce, they think that it's absolute folly. At least the civil service people within there think it's crazy because it's really going to hurt the U.S. economy. But this time around, the White House is much more radical when it comes to those positions. So what I would say that we learned in the 2017-2019 negotiation of the USMCA is, to the degree that it's possible, to leave out the political noise. You know, the U.S. is not going to try to annex Canada. It's not going to, you know, make Mexico pay for the wall. But at the end of the day, we have to leave that aside and try to concentrate, as President Sheinbaum said, keeping a cool head, retaliating when you have to, and trying to negotiate, because at the end of the day, you know, there's enough pressure within the U.S. and we have to help create it also, Mexico and Canada, with the private sector, with Congress, with civil society, so that cooler heads prevail and that he winds up moving towards more moderate positions, which is what wound up happening in 2018 when we finally were able to sign a trade agreement. A year before that, that seemed impossible.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Cooler heads prevail, a good message for folks to take with them. Thank you very much for your time. Kenneth Smith Ramos, Mexico's former chief negotiator for the modernization of NAFTA.
Real pleasure, Catherine. Thank you.
We're going to head now to the White House. U.S. President Donald Trump has just signed new executive orders.
No, but I would. I mean, he's now cleaner than anybody in this room. You got a pardon. He's cleaner than anybody in the room. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Next, in 2018, you imposed ad valorem duties, tariffs on imports of steel at a 25% rate. Since that time, a large number of exclusions and exceptions to that tariff rule have been implemented. Because of the damage to the United States steel industry that those exceptions and exclusions have imposed, we're now, this order would reimpose that 25% ad valorem tariff rate on imports of steel, and it's presented for your signature now.
Okay. Do you understand what that means? It's a big deal. It's a big deal. This is the beginning of making America rich again. Mr. Secretary, do you have anything to say? As you know, Howard is Secretary of Commerce, doing a fantastic job. And what do you have to say about it?
So when you imposed the tariffs the first time, you added 120,000 jobs. And since that time, it's been picked away and nicked away and excluded away, and we've lost 107,000 jobs. And remember, these aren't just general jobs. These are steel workers in America, and now you're going to bring them back. You're going to bring those 120,000 jobs back to America. You are the president who's standing up for the American steel worker, and I am just tremendously impressed and delighted to stand next to you.
So let me just make a statement, and essentially this is another way of saying we're doing a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. So the failed American trade policies have led our once incredible United States steel and aluminum industries, once incredible, it's once incredible, they're not now, but they're not bad. I saved them because of my first term, totally saved them. If I didn't do what I did, I put massive tariffs, not the highest level, but pretty massive tariffs. We took in a lot of money and we took in a lot of jobs, but we were being pummeled by both friend and foe alike. Our nation requires steel and aluminum to be made in America, not in foreign lands. We need to create, in order to protect our country's future, a resurgence of U.S. manufacturing and production, the likes of which has not been seen for many decades. It's time for our great industries to come back to America. I want them back to America. This is the first of many, and you know what I mean by that. We're going to be doing others on other subjects, topics. Protecting our steel and aluminum industries is a must, and today I'm simplifying our tariffs on steel and aluminum so that everyone can understand exactly what it means. It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions, and that's all countries, no matter where it comes from, all countries. If made in the United States, however, United States of America, there is no tariff, zero. So if it's made in the United States, there is no tariff. All you have to do is make it in the United States. We don't need it from another country. As an example, Canada, if we make it in the United States, we don't need it to be made in Canada. We'll have the jobs. That's why Canada should be our 51st state. We'll bring back industries, and we'll bring back our jobs, and we'll make America industry great again. So essentially, we're putting on a 25% tariff without exception on all aluminum and all steel. And it's going to mean a lot of businesses are going to be opening in the United States. Now, we're going to be meeting over the next 4-week period, maybe on a weekly basis, and maybe we'll do a couple of them at different times and maybe together. But we'll be talking about other subjects like cars. We'll be talking about drugs and pharmaceuticals. We'll be discussing chips, and we're going to be doing some other things in addition to that, all which will bring in a lot of jobs into our country. Cars is going to be a very big one and a very important one, and America is going to be stronger than it ever was before. Okay? So are you finished with everything, I think?
We have aluminum still to sign here,
Okay, let's
sir.
go.
So with respect to aluminum, similarly to steel, since 2018, a large number of exceptions and exemptions have been added into the law. This eliminates all of those and also increases the ad valorem tariff rate from 10 to 25%.
Mostly the last part is the most important, right? Would you say?
Totally.
So basically, this is aluminum, the same thing, no exceptions, no nothing. And it's going to bring our aluminum business back and may go higher. I mean, frankly, it may go higher. And we're going to also be talking about we're going to be talking about things over the next 3 weeks that I think will be amazing for our country, amazing for our jobs, and will bring us to a new level of prosperity. And I think, frankly, our allies and our enemies all over the world expected this. They really expected it for years. They really expected it sometime during the Biden administration, but they didn't do anything. As you know, I put tariffs on China. We took in hundreds of billions of dollars with those tariffs, and Biden wasn't able to get them out. He tried to, but it was too much money. He couldn't do it. And we're going to be doing a very concise and, you know, it's going to be good. And I don't think if done properly, and we're going to try and do that, we don't want it to hurt other countries, but they've been taking advantage of us for years and years and years. And they've charged us tariffs. Most of them have charged us, almost every one, I would say, almost without exception. Definitely. They've charged us, and we haven't charged them. And it's time to be reciprocal. So you'll be hearing that word a lot, reciprocal. If they charge us, we charge them. If they're at 25, we're at 25. If they're at 10, we're at 10. And if they're much higher than 25, that's what we are too. So that's having to do with everything. That's not just steel and aluminum. But we'll be discussing that over the next couple of weeks. But we will be looking at chips, and we will be looking at cars, and we're going to be looking at pharmaceuticals, and there'll be a couple of other things also in addition. That'll be
Mr. President,
Yes.
Mr. President, U.S. steel workers have said that they support this move. But what would you say to American consumers who are worried that prices
That they do support this move?
U.S. steelmakers.
I love the steel makers. That's
But,
good.
well, what do you say
Of course
to
they,
American
because they want to save their businesses. U.S. Steel will now be a very valuable company. Anybody that makes steel is going to be great. Anybody that works in big steel is going to be very happy.
What do you say to consumers who are worried about prices, sir?
Oh, I don't think you're going to. No, you're going to ultimately have a price reduction because they're going to make their steel here. There's not going to be any tariff. These foreign companies will move to the United States, will make their steel and aluminum in the United States. Ultimately, it'll be cheaper. But we'll also have jobs, many, many more jobs.
Sir, what are you looking at in terms of tariffs on cars and chips?
Well, we're looking at numbers, and we'll be coming up with a number, but we make some of the finest cars in the world, and some companies prohibit us from selling those cars in their countries. But they sell us cars, they send cars to us, and we don't do that. We charge nothing or 2.5%, and they'll be charging 100%. They'll be charging much more than that if you look at some of them. So I think those days are over. But we'll be announcing on other things, such as cars. We got some other things we'll be doing. But the biggest thing is reciprocal. We want tariffs to be fair. If they charge us, we charge them.
Tomorrow, the reciprocal tariffs?
We'll be doing reciprocal over the next, I would say, 2 days, don't you think? 2 days, yeah, maybe.
Mr. President, the Australian Prime Minister has said that you are considering an exemption for Australia on steel. Is that correct? And why?
I just spoke to him, very fine man, and he has a surplus. I mean, we have a surplus with Australia, one of the few. And the reason is they buy a lot of airplanes. They are rather far away, and they need lots of airplanes. And we actually have a surplus. It's one of the only countries which we do. And I told him that that's something that we will give great consideration to.
And would you consider one for the UK as well?
Well, we have a huge deficit with the UK. Big difference.
You don't have a deficit with Argentina. Is that country also going to be?
We have a deficit with a little deficit with Argentina. We almost with every country, but Australia, because of the airplanes, they buy a lot of airplanes. There's a little bit of a surplus.
Mr. President, if other countries retaliate,
I don't mind.
What is your plan for example, farmers? Last term, you.
Well, the farmers are going to be helped greatly. Yeah, the farmers are going to be helped greatly because they're not going to be dumping everything into our country. This would be a great bill for farmers. And in terms of retaliation, if they retaliate, it's, as I said, it's reciprocal. So if they raise it a little bit, then we raise it automatically. So I don't think it helps for them to retaliate. But also remember this, they can't really retaliate because we're the piggy bank. We're the piggy bank. But if we don't do this, we won't be the piggy bank for long. We won't be much of a country.
Mr. President, you see that report, sir, that Hamas was going to stop releasing Israeli hostages, and what was your reaction?
I think it's terrible. Look, I looked at the hostages that came in, and they're emaciated. It looked like something out of the 1930s. It's an absolute disgrace. And I think they saw the way the world viewed it, and they're looking for a reason not to send more because they're all. You take a look at that. It looks like it was a concentration camp, which essentially it was. It looks like they came out of the Holocaust. And what a sad thing. One of them was a young man, good-looking guy, a little bit heavier than perhaps he could have been, and now he looks like he's not even recognizable. Not even recognizable.
Is the ceasefire deal at risk of falling apart?
Look, I can tell you that those people have been badly hurt, both mentally and physically. I'm talking about the young women that came out also previously. And I think one of the reasons they're doing this is because they're probably sending the best. What you see is probably the best. because they want to send people that look at least healthy. And that's not healthy. These people have been badly hurt. They've been interviewed by our representatives. They've been interviewed by Israeli representatives, and they're really hurting. They are really hurting mentally and physically. And I think Hamas is looking at that and saying, well, it's not going to get much better than that, because they probably send out their best as a representative, and they've got more to send out, and they probably feel that they can't do that because it's not going to make them look very good.
Is the ceasefire if they delay that, sir? Should the ceasefire then be off?
Well, I would say this, and I'm going to let that because that's Israel's decision, but as far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I think it's an appropriate time. I would say cancel it and all bets are off, and let hell break out. I'd say they ought to be returned by 12 o'clock on Saturday, and if they're not returned, all of them, not in drips and drabs, not 2 and 1 and 3 and 4 and 2. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, I would say all hell is going to break out. And I don't think they're going to do it. I think a lot of them are dead. I think a lot of the hostages are dead. I think it's a great human tragedy what's happened, how people can be that mean to do. I mean, the one guy was laughing when a hostage, he thought his family was alive, found out the family was dead, and his captor, so to speak, started laughing because he thought it was so funny. You know, this is a different group of people. No, I would say Saturday at 12, we want them all back. I'm speaking for myself. Israel can override it, but from myself, Saturday at 12 o'clock, and if they're not here, all hell is going to break out.
Mr. President, in an interview this weekend, you said that Palestinians would not be guaranteed the right to return to Gaza if the U.S. were to develop it. What did you mean by that? And under
We've spoken to a lot of Palestinians. They would love to leave Gaza if they could find a place to be. And I've spoken to various leaders of various countries in the not so, distant area from where we're talking about, the Gaza Strip. And I think they were very positive about providing land. What we need is land. And if we could build a nice place for people to live safely, everybody in Gaza would do it. They've been persecuted. They've been spit on. They've been treated like trash. And they would love to get out of Gaza. But until now, they never had an alternative. Now they have an alternative. And as far as Hamas is concerned, you're seeing the real Hamas now with the hostages.
Mr. President,
what if they
on Gaza, you're having
Who are you, from where?
The Wall Street Journal, sir.
Yeah, that's what I
thought. Jordanian leader is coming in to see you.
Yeah.
Folks in Jordan have expressed
Tomorrow.
opposition to taking in more Gazans, more Palestinians. How are you going to convince him to do otherwise?
I think he'll take. I do think he'll take, and I think other countries will take also. They have good hearts. I think they'll take.
But what about the Palestinians who just won't leave? Our team has spoken to many.
They're all going to leave when they have a place that's a better alternative. When they have a nice place that's safe, they're all going to leave. It's a hellhole right now.
But how are you so sure? Would the U.S. force them to leave?
You're going to see that they're all going to want to leave.
Mr. President, when it comes to Saturday at noon, there's an American hostage who's still being held by Hamas right now. Are you worried about
Look, who knows? Are they alive? Are they not alive? But I saw the condition. When I saw the condition of the last ones that came out, and the women too, everybody. The one woman had her hand blown off because she was trying to stop a bullet being fired at her, okay? What kind of a situation is that? You saw her. I just think it's time to either you release everybody. They're not going to be alive right now, based on what I saw over the last 2 days. They're not going to be alive for long. Saturday at 12 o'clock, and after that, it's going to be a different ballgame.
Mr. President, when you say you have been listening to comments from Donald Trump just moments ago in the Oval Office, signing executive orders, and of course the news that many in Canada have been waiting and watching to see. He did indeed sign an executive order calling for tariffs of 25% on steel and aluminum from all over the world coming into the United States that would, of course, affect Canada. Our colleagues at Bloomberg News reporting that the new tariffs will kick in March 4th per an official, although we did not hear that from Donald Trump just there. But for some reaction about what these tariffs could mean for Canada, I'm joined by Catherine Cobden. She's the president and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. Thank you for coming into studio.
Thanks, Catherine.
So I have to start, obviously, by asking you, what is your reaction to what you just heard?
Obviously, we're disappointed. We thought we should and could and might still, if the March 4th date holds, seek an exemption to these tariffs. Canada is a very unique trading partner on steel with the United States. So we expect and hope that our government is explaining again our business case or our rationale for why we should be exempted. And so if that date can be confirmed, we haven't seen the executive order yet, but if that date is confirmed, then perhaps that gives us more opportunity to do that. And then I'll say the other reaction I have is, well, if this is going forward, Canada, it's time to act.
Okay, so a few things I want to, we all want to hear what does it's time to act mean, but I think first it's probably important for folks to understand, if these tariffs come into effect, what does that look like for the businesses you represent? What does it mean for Canada?
So I want to say that in 2018, we had tariffs of 25% for a year. And these tariffs were actually devastating to the industry on both sides of the border. That's how we got, how did we, Canada, successfully get out of tariff regime back then? Well, it's because there was enough pain on the American side as well to compel. Now, why is that? Well, we have $20 billion of trade between our two countries. You have steel moving back and forth. We're highly integrated for transformations for market uses. So we're their largest definitely their largest import market share into the United States, but so are they to us. They're our largest steel supplier that's outside of our country.
I think that could be confusing for some Canadians who would say, well then, could everybody just play in their own sandbox and everything would be fine? Explain why that is, the simple solution is not.
It's not.
So easy.
It does sound great, but that's not actually in practical terms the way it works, because we have steel that they need and they have steel that we need, and why make it here if we can get it there. We also there's many examples of different types of products that we make that they don't make, and that sort of thing.
We need each other.
We need each other. Exactly. The other comment I wanted to make about our previous experience was we saw a price surge. We saw prices go up by 38%. Maybe that's helpful or maybe that isn't, right? Depending on the circumstances. I think in this economy that is a challenge that will come back, I think, through the American people of concern. But for now, that's a bit of a reflection on history, and I'm hopeful that those, But the other really important point is we're not in 2018 anymore. Since that time, we have done substantial things in Canada to keep pace with the United States trading regime on steel specifically. And so that's, also, I think, part of the business case to pursue an off-ramp. I noted this afternoon, Australia is engaging in those kind of conversations, and I presume Canada will be as well.
You talk about prices going up. I mean, does this, again, presuming it goes ahead, and we'll put a big asterisk next to that given the amount of time that, according to reports, it remains to be seen. But presuming this goes ahead, does it mean loss of business? Do Canadian businesses move to the United States? Are there job losses? Like, what are some more concrete?
All of that's already started, I will say, for sure. But I think the degree, how far it gets and how damaging it gets to the Canadian steel production capacity will very much depend on how Canada reacts. So, that's where the time to act piece kicks in, because, there are things we could be doing a whole lot better in Canada to support our domestic steel industry. And I think this is a crisis that's going to command that attention to adjust our policies and our approaches to ensure that domestic steel has a better chance of succeeding in our own market.
So you've got a wish list, which presumably you have shared with the government. What's at the top of the list?
So the most important thing is we have to get unfair trade out of our marketplace. So for example, let me share you a fact. Everything we send, up to everything, 97% or more of what we share with the United States has been melted in USMCA regions, so either United States, Mexico, or Canada. Here in our own country, we don't even have that track record. We have a significant volume of steel coming in from offshore import locations that are proven to be unfair traders.
Are we talking primarily about China here?
We're talking about China, but there's many other countries. There's a wide range of cases against steel producers globally. I will say as a result of Chinese overcapacity, but lots of steel moves from China to other countries before it comes here. So job one, if it isn't to get out of the tariffs, if we're facing the tariffs, we have to retaliate, and then we also have to do more to protect our domestic market from unfair trade.
Now, I note that the government has taken action since 2018 on this. There are tariffs, I believe, on Chinese steel.
Yeah.
Why is that not good enough?
Well, that's just China direct.
Okay.
So China does a lot to move steel through other countries. I mean, that's part of the concern, I think, that the Trump administration has with some of our other trading allies, is how much Chinese steel is moving through there. The great news is this fact that I'm telling you, 97%. So we are not done. We're not a backdoor to China. That number tells you we are USMCA, fair traders, and that's what we do. So, but those other measures that you mentioned are really critical, and I think that's we took China direct tariffs, and we've taken transparency of supply. So now every import that comes into the country, whether it's from China or rerouted, you will know exactly where it was made. And that's really important to the United States and to ourselves to have that kind of visibility. So my thoughts are, these are really strong points to get out of this. But if we don't get out of this, we need to retaliate hard and fast, and then we need to look to what can we do in our own market, because that's all we'll have left.
When you talk, I pause there because obviously that's a significant point.
Yeah.
When you talk about we need to retaliate, to your mind, do we copy and paste the playbook from last time? Are we back to Florida orange juice and Kentucky bourbon, and maybe we make some alterations based on where the political power is now, or is this a whole new ballgame?
So I think there's a lot of utility to some of the previous approaches. I will say, however, we were quite concerned last weekend when the Canadian government did not have steel tariffs in the first initial reaction. So one of the things we're very actively pursuing right now is steel must be part of the very initial retaliation.
So my understanding, there was going to be a second set of products where they wanted to consult. Is it that you believe that they would want a consultation process, and you're saying that's not the case, or you're worried that you're...
We were disappointed that they decided to put us in that second tranche in what happened last weekend. I know it was just a few days. Days ago. It
Who
feels
can
like,
keep track anymore?
Yeah. But honestly, we don't believe that's necessary. There's a lot of knowledge about steel trade and steel inputs across this country and between our two nations. So we think we can act now, and we're asking the government to do so.
Again, when it comes to the question of counter tariffs, all of this is economic pain for Canadians. So what case would you make to folks who maybe don't feel very personally invested in the steel industry? They think, okay, well, this is obviously bad for Canada, but how would you explain to them why this kind of economic pain is necessary?
Well, I want to mention that, first of all, I'd like to appeal to Canadians. And by the way, I don't feel like I need to appeal very much. I am shocked and really blown away by the support we have received right across this country over the last 24 hours from people, citizens, organizations, obviously, political parties, et cetera. A wide swath of Canadians have been today standing united with us, and we really are grateful for that. I've forgotten what the point
is it comparable to last time?
No, it's more.
Yeah. And what do you make of that?
Because we're in this moment of so much chaos and uncertainty. We just don't know what, and some of the broader context of what the president is saying about our country, that's kind of, inflamed this interest of standing up for Canadians and Canadian industry.
I wonder, you and I spoke on CBC Radio's The House, which is the show that I normally host, right as President Trump was reelected, the days after the election. And you said, I'm not highly optimistic, but I'm cautiously optimistic that we have done work since last time. You felt like the scenario that we seem to be on the precipice of was avoidable.
Yeah.
Now, with that, 2 months plus of time, how do you make sense of the fact that optimism seems to have been misplaced?
Yeah, well, again, I'm hopeful that we're going to push to the wall to get this out and to get ourselves out. And, I will point to USW International, the United Steelworkers Union, a very powerful union in the States and in Canada, came out just today, moments before I walked in, to say that Canada should be exempt from this tariff. That's powerful. So I'm not ready to give up. We're going to fight this fight because we must, for the sake of the domestic industry. Oh, I wanted to say, you were asking me, how do I appeal to Canadians? Well,
yeah.
first I said, I don't think we need to do that. They're there. But I would add that, Canadians need to think about, or hopefully will think about, not need to, but hopefully will consider the strategic nature of the steel industry. If you are a country that needs, steel for your automotive sector, your energy sector, your defense sector, your critical infrastructure sector, we're very strategic. We don't want to be reliant on other nations for these types of, solutions. We need to build a bridge, or we need to build a nuclear power plant, or we need to build a new tank. We want to know that we have some Canadian supply. We don't want to be reliant entirely on other nations for those really core things.
It is interesting to note this date of March 4th, and I know you want to be cautious with this because
Yep.
neither you nor I have
Haven't seen
seen the executive order, but as being reported by Bloomberg is of course the same day that the 30-day reprieve is also supposed to be up. I said a moment ago that when you and I spoke the days after Donald Trump was elected, you said you were cautiously optimistic. How would you describe how you feel now with these few weeks ahead of us?
All I'll say is we are, the Canadian steel industry, united in our fight against this challenge, and that we are ready to work with our government, with all these stakeholders and Canadians right across the country to ensure this doesn't happen. So rather than being cautiously optimistic, I'll say we're ready for the fight.
Okay, well, we are going to leave it there. Thank you very much for being here to react to this news just as it's breaking. Appreciate it, Catherine.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's Catherine Cobden, President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association. More coming up on Power and Politics next. Our top story, U.S. President Donald Trump is imposing a 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum imports. That includes steel and aluminum from Canada. Here Trump is signing that order last hour.
It's a big deal. It's a big deal. This is the beginning of making America rich again. Essentially, this is another way of saying we're doing a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. So the failed American trade policies have led our once incredible United States steel and aluminum industries, once incredible, it's once incredible, not now, but they're not bad. I saved them because of my first term, totally saved them. If I didn't do what I did, I put massive tariffs, not the highest level, but pretty massive tariffs. We took in a lot of money and we took in a lot of jobs. But we were being pummeled by both friend and foe alike. Our nation requires steel and aluminum to be made in America, not in foreign lands. We need to create, in order to protect our country's future, a resurgence of U.S. manufacturing and production, the likes of which has not been seen for many decades. It's time for our great industries to come back to America. I want them back to America. This is the first of many. And you know what I mean by that. We're going to be doing others on other subjects, topics.
Trump also specifically named Canada as a target of these new tariffs, and he threatened more tariffs to come over the next few weeks.
As an example, Canada, if we make it in the United States, we don't need it to be made in Canada. We'll have the jobs. That's why Canada should be our 51st state. We'll bring back industries, and we'll bring back our jobs, and we'll make America industry great again. So essentially, we're putting on a 25% tariff without exception on all aluminum and all steel. And it's going to mean a lot of businesses are going to be opening in the United States. Now, we're going to be meeting over the next 4-week period, maybe on a weekly basis, and maybe we'll do a couple of them at different times and maybe together. But we'll be talking about other subjects like cars. We'll be talking about drugs and pharmaceuticals. We'll be discussing chips, and we're going to be doing some other things in addition to that, all which will bring in a lot of jobs into our country.
The steel and aluminum tariffs will overwhelmingly impact Canada. Canada sends 6 million tons of steel to the U.S. in 2024. That is the most of any country. Mexico is America's second biggest supplier. The U.S. is much more reliant on Canada for aluminum. Last year, Canada exported more than double the aluminum to the U.S. than the next 9 nations combined. Now, we are at this hour still waiting for a response from the Canadian government. An official told CBC News that they had been waiting to see the information about these tariffs on paper before responding. Now that the order has been signed, we're watching to see what the federal government will say about it. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau overseas right now in Paris for a major conference on artificial intelligence. Opposition leaders have already come out today calling for a tit-for-tat response.
We will retaliate in kind with matching tariffs on American aluminum and steel, all of the proceeds of which will be given back to our steel and aluminum industry, and any surplus will be given in tax relief for our people.
We should respond with retaliatory tariffs, dollar for dollar. And then on top of that, I want supports in place for the workers impacted. In this case, starting with steel and aluminum, but we need a package in place for all the workers and all the sectors that might be impacted.
Okay, I'm Catherine Cullen sitting in for David Cochran. Thank you so much for watching Power and Politics. Please stay right here on CBC News Network. Canada Tonight is up next with Dwight Drummond, and you know there is going to be a lot more coverage of this developing issue as well on The National tonight. We are going to be back with the latest from Ottawa tomorrow. Have a good evening.